I'm Barbara Spurd, a board member of the Port Jefferson documentary series. I hope you enjoyed watching our presentation of Oliver Sacks' His Own Life and are ready to sit back and enjoy our Q&A with our moderator, Tom Needham, host of Sounds of Film, WUSB Radio, and our very special guest speaker, three-time Emmy Award-winning writer, director, and producer of Oliver Sacks' His Own Life, Rick Burns. Again, I want to thank you for joining us and allowing us to be in your home. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Tom and Rick. Thank you. Take it away.
Thank you. Well, Rick, congratulations. I love the movie. Before we get into our discussion about the film, maybe you could tell our viewers a little bit about how the coronavirus has affected you and the process of releasing this film, if there's any kind of effect at all.
Wow. First of all, Tom, Barbara, Wendy, it's so wonderful to be with you. And it's been a kind of a long ride over this last year since I met some of you. I'm out on Long Island, and I'm really thrilled to be here now in August of our Corona year. It's been a tough one for everybody, hasn't it? Fortunately, nobody close to my family or me has gotten sick, but certainly our lives have been turned upside down. One thing I found as a result of that, obviously there are stressors that abound within this situation for all of us. One thing I found is that it really focuses my family and myself. I think it focuses everybody on what matters most. And I found that this funny kind of, it's not rarefied, but this austere time where we're apart from so many people, and there's so much uncertainty, the things that really count most to us, whether it's family or movies or the meaning of life, really, I found myself more than once, doubling down on all the things which I feel, are most worth holding on to and focusing on. And so maybe that's going to be the inevitable silver lining that comes out of this very difficult moment where, we're not so much on pause, but we're in a major reflecting mode. And I just noticed that with respect to work and play and love and family and friends and everything, it has had a way of really focusing one's intention. So that maybe that's good. Maybe that's a good thing. And I certainly think in this 2020 year of politics and change and so many things happening that perhaps maybe we'll be a little bit less cluttered as we think about how to take our next steps forward. In any case, I hope, Tom, you and your family are well. And I'm thrilled to share this film, which is Oliver, how about Oliver Mensch, this kind of this wonderful Jewish kid from North London who's everybody in his family was a doctor except for his brother Michael, who was schizophrenic, and they were Orthodox Jews, and he turned out to be a closet gay person, and he was English, and he was atheist, which means I know for sure there was only one place for Oliver Sacks to end up, and that was in New York City. And I think he would be so proud to be here as he is posthumously in this film. So on behalf of Oliver, who I love, got to know at the very end, thank you for having me.
Well, that's great. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was, we talked about COVID, but in your movie, there's actually a reference to an earlier pandemic in America, and it actually ends up playing a pretty critical
Huge
part in Oliver's life indirectly. Can you explain that?
Right. Yeah, I mean, after the famous Spanish flu virus of 1918, once that had come and gone, there was an interval in the 20s where there was another rather less broad-based pandemic, but still a very serious one called lethargica encephalitis lethargica, sleepy sickness. One of whose really profound consequences was it seemed to kind of suspend its victims in a sort of a vegetative state. who they seemed to have gone to sleep, but they couldn't be woken from it. And this lasted for 20, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. If you fast forward from the 1920s to the 1960s, by which time Oliver, born in the 1930s, was now someone who just finished his residency. He'd gotten a medical degree at Oxford, then escaped his family to North America, to San Francisco and Los Angeles, where he'd done, his residency in neurological work. And he ended up at a kind of a warehousing hospital called Beth Abraham in the Bronx in the 1960s. And among the 500-600 patients at Beth Abraham were 70 or 80 who were, had succumbed to the encephalitis lethargica now 40 years later. And as Oliver pointed out, Oliver was just trying to find his way. He had kind of failed as a bench scientist. He was sort of unlucky and ham-handed in his romantic relationships and very, very worried about his own sexuality. He was gay and didn't want to acknowledge it. And he had been kind of sent out to pasture to this place which was like the least desirable job for a neurologist. And when he got there in 65, 66, the nurses pointed out that there was this cohort of people from the sleepy sickness time who the nurses were convinced there was something going on there. They were not in permanent brain dead comas. They were not in vegetative states. There was a real live person inside there. And Oliver took the victims of this pandemic and began to work with them. They had some Parkinson's-like symptoms, though they were not Parkinsonian. And it had been recently discovered that L-DOPA, a precursor of dopamine, was working on Parkinson's victims. And it was thought, Oliver wondered, would it have an effect on his patients? And in a remarkable sequence of events, starting from around 1969, 1970, 1971, a lot of these people woke up and came to, they had not been completely unconscious, but they had been in a kind of a hypnagogic dream state between waking and unconsciousness. And they came back to life. The tragic and harrowing part of it was that the L-DOPA was not a permanent cure. It wasn't as if they could titrate a solution and figure out how to keep these patients stable. And they had all of them had a very complicated range of effects. In this very complex human situation with the sleepy sickness victims, Oliver did this long, detailed research on them as a young, kind of trying to figure his own way, clinical neurologist in the Bronx. And that work, which involved not just hours, weeks, months at a time with you, talking to them, writing down their life stories. So he was not just kind of like flying in for a visit and then going on. He got in detail and wrote up their biographies. And in 1972, sat down to write up his account of this experience with these remarkable patients. That became Awakenings. As them awakened from their somnolence, as Oliver himself awakened from a long and very tormented sort of coming to maturity. He was a long rite of passage for Oliver Sacks. And he came out of that and was sort of brought back together with his mother, who had originally abominated him. That was her word when he came out to her at 18 and said, "Mom, I'm gay." And his mother, bless her, who loved her youngest son, Oliver, dearly, found that too much to handle, partly with another son who was so grievously afflicted with schizophrenia. And they found a kind of a new kind of common ground as Oliver's career began to take shape. And as Oliver described it, he and his mother, Muriel Landau Sacks, wrote the book together in the summer of 1972. And it turned out to be the last summer of her life. And she died that fall on a trip to Israel of a heart attack. So just, what I find amazing is that this is sort of like, this is like all of our lives or more so. You kind of ask the question of it or pull a thread of it, and out comes the remarkable, complicated, unpredictable warp and woof of a whole experience. And for Oliver, his existence as a doctor was inseparable from that, now 40-year-old pandemic, which sent these patients who had just basically been on the show, and who, a combination of luck and temperament and brilliance, and the nurses who knew better, showed Oliver a way to at least temporarily reinvent their experience and certainly reinvent his own experience.
Rick, the thing that I really found fascinating with your movie is the emphasis on how he discovered the importance of stories in patients' lives. And I had no idea that for the longest time, doctors really didn't, and maybe even some today still don't, think that the story of someone's life is that important. It's based on lab tests and, looking at, what they see on the patient's body. But he discovered through writing these books about his patients and talking to them that their personal stories sometimes can offer clues.
Absolutely.
And that's so amazing, and he really focused on that in this film.
It was, inevitable because of the kind of work Oliver did and the kind of work, in a way, he pioneered. Neurology was an infant science. And even by the mid 20th century, it was still finding its ways. And as techniques were developed to increase the accuracy of its quantitative ability to measure, through assays and through X-rays, and then later through MRIs and CAT scans, this fundamental reality, which is experience. All of us have this experience of being Rick or Tom or Barbara or Wendy. And it's unique to all of us. We're the only people who have direct access to it. And it's really, in a way, the most fundamental quality of being alive. The inner story each of us has and carries within us. And neurology was at a point, it wasn't disregarding the importance of experience and subjectivity and interior life. It just didn't know how to measure it. And Oliver kind of wandered onto the scene, a half century after Freud, and went, the stories, biographies of the inner worlds of people are incredibly telling. They're deeply moving, they're information rich, and they are a form of data. And that's why his intuition from the very start was, as he put it, my work, who we all are, all my patients and all of us together, are where biology and biography intersect. Where the bunch of wet works in chemistry intersects the unique life story unfolding for each of us inside, and that you can't do one without the other. And for that reason, he was really disregarded. This was not what neurology was. It wasn't what clinical neurology was. It wasn't what, sort of medical or research neurology was in the 1960s or 70s, and indeed on into the 1980s. And so people were skeptical, neglectful of his early writings, of awakenings, of his book on migraine. And it really wasn't until the 1980s that the world began to catch on to the idea, and I don't mean the world generally, I mean the world of neuroscience itself, that there was scientific data of a qualitative kind that was crucially important. And, among the wonderful things that happened for Oliver is, after a long time in the wilderness, partly self-imposed and partly imposed by the circumstances I'm trying to describe, in the 1980s, late 1980s, he was kind of discovered by an amazing cohort of neuroscientists. And I just don't mean like a couple here or there. Francis Crick, who had co-discovered the molecular structure of DNA with James Watson in the 1950s, turned the rest of his time and attention as a scientist trying to uncover the neural correlates of consciousness. How can you do all this stuff with physics and natural material and end up with, I'm hungry, I'm angry, the sky is red, I miss my husband, I miss my wife, all that inner experience. How does that come to be? And Francis Crick, with his younger colleague, Christoph Koch, who we were fortunate to interview for the film and was a good friend of Oliver's, sought Oliver out and said, you've done this incredible book, his first on migraine, describing from the inside out what it's like to have visual migraines, and how it's not so much how the brain is affected, it's how the experience of vision is affected. And that emphasis on experience was something that the leading neuroscientists of the 1980s and 90s and then the aughts, Gerald Edelman, Christoph Koch, Francis Crick, and others went, wow, this unusual kind of self-made neuroscientist storyteller has an enormous amount to offer. And so even needless to say, as part of Oliver's story, that was a remarkable step forward to discover, like, because, you know, sometimes he was just like Rodney Dangerfield. Hey, what? And suddenly incredibly respectable people are seeking him out and looking for conversation with him.
Can I ask you, in terms of the consciousness, so many people today are listening to podcasts.
Sure.
And Sam Harris has one of the most popular ones, and he's writing and talking a lot about consciousness today.
Yes, indeed.
And I was wondering, what exactly was Oliver Sacks's impression of what consciousness is? Because people are still debating it today. I understand that it's not a clear-cut thing.
No, I mean, Oliver himself said in his wonderful way in our interview, which went 90 hours of interviews, we were so that got this terrible diagnosis, and they called us up and said, Oliver's dying, will you come in and film him? So for 90 hours from February to June of 2015, the year he died, there we were talking with Oliver for the most part, but not exclusively, in his apartment in Greenwich Village. Sometimes up in the Botanical Gardens, one of his haunts, at Beth Abraham, where the Awakenings patients had been. And Oliver said at one point, in this kind of offhand way, he says, you know, there are three fundamental questions that science really treats. One is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is the world? What's the origin of life? And where does consciousness come from? And Oliver felt of those three fundamental questions, the third, where does consciousness come from, was the thorniest and the trickiest. What is, you know, it's called famously by David Chalmers, an Australian philosopher, the hard problem, by which Chalmers does not mean that all the other problems are easy. But when you turn your attention to try to say, what is this experience that we're having? You know, Descartes said it came from God through our pituitary gland. Ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Oliver was not a Cartesian. He did not believe that God gave us consciousness. He believed that consciousness emerges out of this remarkable, very complex set of physical events. But nevertheless, it has a quality which allows us to be autonomous. It allows, we have it by dint of a certain kind of grace, by which he didn't mean anything overtly religious, but it came for free. It emerges from within us. And as Christoph Koch said, you know, every morning we wake up out of nothingness, because that's what sleep is, and we say, I'm here. And when we're asleep, and certainly when we're dead, we're not there. And then suddenly we are there, and this extraordinary thing, which is so familiar to us all and so fundamentally mysterious, the experience of selfhood and awareness of the world. And I dare say that Oliver found that fact as miraculous a fact as he could ponder on. You know, on a line, in keeping with, like, well, there's a world. How amazing is that?
Yeah.
There's life within it. We're all not just a bunch of rocks. And then within that, there's this very special subcategory of physical structure, whose most salient quality is that we can sit there and have inner experiences and choose among them, think about them, change our own channel, compartmentalize, do whatever we do with our own interior world. I mean, as Christoph Koch said, you know, it didn't have to be that way. We could have been all like zombies, the lights on and nobody's home. But it turns out the lights on and somebody's home. Career was really spent going like, you know, knock, 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 I'm in here. And by the way, here are my patients, some of whom are grievously afflicted. They're knocking on their own window and saying, hey, I'm here. And that is a primal condition of all of us. We're all of us, in some sense, coronavirus locked in. And we have some ability to reach out, but it's limited and it's always circumstantial. And that made him turn the telescope of awareness of other people and other realities around. He did not find patients who were afflicted particularly different or unusual. They were just like everybody, only more so. And so his work had this tremendous integrative capacity. You know, wow, you know, somebody who signs because they're mute and deaf, they're not disabled, they're differently abled. They have a different, their brain, and we now know this, and quantitative science has long since caught up. They're using all sorts of neural landscape and geography to do things in signing that we couldn't begin to imagine. It's not just they've kind of transcoded something, you know, somewhat into an altered language. There's charm, irony, wit, skepticism, a complete universe happening out of a different part of the brain. Wow, that's the way we all kind of are. And so Oliver had this tremendous, you know, small d democratic sense of like, each of us has been given we've been dealt the cards we have, and it creates this way of being in the world, and there's no two that are alike, or rather we're all alike in we each have our own special, you know, concert of inner events which make up who we are.
Rick, I'm wondering what is the correlation between the work that he does and your own work? I mean, you've been doing historical documentaries and biographical films for quite some time. And I've seen you many, many times. You're always so passionate about whatever subject you're immersed in. Do you see any kind of overlap between the two of you in what you do?
I have found, I think that the overlap all of us would feel with what was sort of the abiding obsession that Oliver had, with experience and the dynamic of trying to find bridges between our own experience and other people's experience. I mean, what is a story? A story is something we tell for whatever reasons in order to bridge the gap between one subjectivity and another subjectivity. And once you've got it, T.S. Eliot called it an objective correlative. It's something that's now outside a brain, and it can be represented in symbols, whether they're audio symbols or visual symbols or any one of a number, a semaphore. They now exist and have a physical reality, and it can take an enormously, it turns out, complex set of data and experience and share it. And so that incredible thing that we have when anybody tells a story, where we kind of settle in. Nobody's making us, but if there's a story underway, you know, and, you know, it can begin in the most routine of ways. Film starts, close up, telephone, it rings. Who's calling? I don't know who it's to. I don't know who it's from. All I know is that a phone has rung, meaning an attempt to bridge two consciousnesses is underway. I'm going to hang on and find out who's on both ends of those wires. That storytelling process is the beginning of community. It's how we form units of construction larger than ourselves, but that include ourselves, in which we find a home temporarily. And so when you come across somebody who, as a scientist, as a human being, and as a storyteller, is that alert to the way all of them intersect. I mean, Oliver knew that, you know, storytelling was the science of human subjectivity. Well, who's the man who mistook his wife for a hat? Or the painter, or the colorblind painter? They're all people in particular situations. I'm going to have to tell you a story so I can get from who they are into who you are. And I think that that's one of the most compelling things people can do when we make these artificial distinctions among scientists or artists, storytellers, or just, you know, people sitting around a campfire. Whereas in fact, we're engaged in this powerful way of forming the human, collective, and individual enterprise when we tell stories. And so I felt, you know, I think there's a Freemasonry, which is huge, of people that without stories, we'd be so screwed.
Yeah.
We'd really be, you know, and it's not just like, well, tell me a story. It is a fundamental building block of our humanity.
In your movie, you do a great job of showing how he had a lot of early problems in his life where he suffered and he was lonely and struggled quite a bit by himself at times. And yet, as a filmmaker, I thought it was very interesting that the most common interview shots that you had in the film of him, he was surrounded by people.
Oh,
that was pretty unique. You know, I don't see that too often in interviews. And I was wondering if you could explain why you did it that way and how that might have changed. Because usually people will take someone off to a quiet spot by themselves. But this was kind of interesting to have an audience.
That you focus on that. It is really unusual for any of the films that I've made. We very quickly called this project the Yes Project, because when Oliver's editor and chief of staff, remarkable woman who started out in publishing, named Kate Edgar, who's featured in the film and is the head of the Oliver Sacks Archive now. You know, when Kate with Oliver called us up, she said, "Oliver's dying, would you come in and film him?" And we kind of thought for about a minute and went, "Sure, yes, we'll do that." And so what that meant is that the process of making a film was kind of turned on its head. You know, you get an idea, you think about it, you debate it to yourself, you kind of create some proposal, some provisional outline of what it could be. You begin to raise money, you raise some money. This was all totally turned around. This was like, we're in. So like within a matter of weeks, we're there in Oliver's living room. So we're saying yes to this, meaning we're going to take this as we find it. When we walked in for what was the first interview, it was Monday morning, February 9th, 2015. He had just gotten the diagnosis about 5 weeks earlier. His sister-in-law, Gay, was there. His niece, Carla, was there. Kate Edgar, his colleague and great friend. His late in life December romance, Bill Hayes, incredible photographer and writer, was there. And we just kind of like came into, that was who was there. Now we were focusing on Oliver, but that sense of him having created his own family. He never had children, youngest himself of 4. His older brothers, David and Marcus, had gotten married. Michael was schizophrenic and never did. Oliver never did, never had children. But he had formed his own kind of Pippi Longstocking family of people who were friends, patients, people he'd met on the street, the elevator man, late in life, his boyfriend, Billy. And so it had this wonderful, like, sort of accidental, warm community who he surrounded himself with, although he was very, very private at the same time. So he had that ratio of reserve to magnanimity, you know, was one of a number of ratios and contradictions that really were striking with him. Very, very shy, disarmingly open. You know, no one who sees our film will ever think of orange jello in quite the and at the same time, extremely fastidious. And then sort of like blurting things out. So he had all these qualities, and that was part of the kind of the Oliver world he kind of created for himself. And if we had tried to curate that in advance, you know what, we'll have the camera here, nobody else will be here, we would have missed something which was really kind of crucial. And at the same time, Oliver himself sort of focused in, and he would create his own very, very private space. So sometimes you could forget everybody. But there was really not a moment when there wasn't somebody else sitting at his elbow or making a cup of tea or laughing at his orange jello remark, or at his orange jello remark. And so I found that really, I think a lot of the things that, right down to and including the topics themselves, where out of the infinite narcissism of people in the arts, you kind of think like it's the ideas that one thinks of oneself are the things that one is true auteur about. You know what? That's bullshit. If you wait for yourself to think of every idea, you're going to end up repeating yourself so quickly, because our stockpile of self-born original ideas is very limited. Whereas the possibility of experience, the phone rings, Kate Edgar, I'm sorry I haven't met. Oh, you work with Oliver Sacks? You know, let the world in. And so from the very beginning, the meaning of the Yes film was like, we're letting the world in. We'll enter Oliver's world just as we find it. And it continued that way, right the way through the process, the whole process of making the film, which was arduous and humbling and took, 4 years to cut. But it was really an amazing experience to go through that and realize, don't think you have the better idea. Let the world come to you with an even better idea.
I know we don't have too much more time, but I did want to ask you about the film Awakenings. You mentioned Awakenings early on in our conversation. But the thing that was fascinating to me was that he struggled so much of his life to get the credit that he deserved for his work. And even the book, when it came out, didn't get the respect that it deserved.
Not at all.
And yet a Hollywood movie comes out with Robin Williams, and then all of a sudden, I mean, at least the way it's portrayed in your movie, all of a sudden he starts getting invited around to all these universities to speak about his ideas. And I was wondering, I guess it's a good thing, because in the end he did get the respect that he deserved, but should it take a Hollywood film for someone?
Always both incredibly pleased and a little bit ironic about that that he suddenly he's getting honorary PhDs and invitations to talk at very, very high-end neurological conferences after the movie with Robert De Niro and Robin Williams comes out. And I think one of the good things is it's good. I really feel strongly, I think Oliver felt this way too. It's good to not have your dreams come true too early. Because when they do, you're kind of more philosophical about it as well.
Yeah.
And you take the newly found good with a little bit of the same grain of salt as you took the, I guess nobody likes this work. And that's probably for the best. I think what had happened is that in the interim between the time Awakenings was written and published, 1973, the time his first popular book came out, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which is a collection of essays, came out in the mid-1980s and became a bestseller just by word of mouth. And suddenly Oliver Sacks was somebody not yet respected by his, by his fellow scientists, but a best-selling author, now appearing in the pages of the New York Review of Books and the London Review of Books and the New Yorker. He had that kind of literary success. And I think by the time you got to the 90s, 1990 is when Awakenings came out, the movie, I think there had been a kind of a softening up of the ground in the broader neuroscientific community. And Gerald Edelman, an extremely eminent neuroscientist, was beginning to do his work on what he called neural Darwinism. Francis Crick and Christoph Koch were starting to do their work. And so it had begun to be legitimized by serious scientists in a way. And then the movie came out and it was like, oh, well, let's get him. He'll be fantastic. And nobody remembered that there had been this long time he'd spent kind of knocking on the window going, hello, can I come into this exclusive club? So, in that respect, as in so many, things, it was often late September, October, November, and even December for Oliver when his ship came in. And I think it gave him a lot of stamina. It showed the stamina he had, and it made him revealed the long the long stamina and sort of stoicism he had to kind of just hang out. And also I think it gave him a sense of what really matters. You know, he was not easily seduced by fads. He was not particularly political in any overt party way. Things came and things went. He wanted to know about, you know, life, experience, consciousness, the periodic table, the things that give a structure to the most basic aspects. And, you know, not so much the hell with everything else, let everything else take care of itself.
Well, Rick, I want to congratulate you. This is just an incredible film, and I hope that more and more people want to go and take a look at his work as a result of this movie that you made.
Well, Tom, thank you so much. It's been really a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you about it. And I'm so proud that it's Port Jefferson. Thank you for having me.
All right, back to you, Barbara.
Well, this was a wonderful interview, so enlightening. I just want to thank Rick so much for coming and joining us for this Q&A. And Tom, as usual, you've done a great job, and we're so happy to have you on board. I do want to just make a quick announcement before I leave. But before I do, I just want to ask Rick, does he have anything coming up in the future? And if you do, can you please let us know, because we're fans.
Absolutely. Barbara, thank you so much. We have a film about the experience of African Americans on the road during the Jim Crow period coming out this fall. And the Oliver film is being released theatrically, finally. We broadcast on PBS next spring. So, you know, we're either staying out of trouble or staying in trouble, however you look at it. But anytime we could have a chance to cross paths again, I'd love to, Barbara. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you again. On Monday, October 5th, we are going to be screening Miracle Fishing at a drive-in. So we hope that our viewers will stay tuned and watch us then. Thank you both again so much.